I'm Hanna Szczepanowska, and I welcome you all at Tuesday morning's museum seminars in Tokyo. My area of specialty is material science of cultural heritage. Before I'll introduce the main topic of today's presentation, which is Conservation Science of Rattan, I would like to say a few words about conservation science, especially because this topic was brought up during previous lectures. So, what conservation science is? It refers to materials investigation and analysis, aiming to lay the foundation for design of preservation strategies for museum objects. Analytical methods involve use of different instruments, and ideally, the analysis should be carried out without the need of extracting samples from original objects. If samples are used in analysis, they are usually very small and typically around 1 to 2 millimeters large, and often the samples already came from materials separated from the original object. In the background, you see the laboratory which I designed and equipped for the Heritage Conservation Center in Singapore between 2015 and 2019. It shows a full suite of analytical instruments that are typically used in the course of examination. On the right, you see 3 examples out of many possible of micrographs of rattan produced using different types of microscopes. So looking from the top, you see a digital 3D micrograph. In the center is a micrograph generated in reflected light. And at the bottom, confocal laser is scanning image, which is showing surface of rattan. So each one provides us with a different set of information about material which we study. Today I'll investigate rattan as material used in cultural heritage objects. The notion of studying rattan was seeded a long time ago when I worked on a book for my students exploring materials in cultural heritage. And I was really surprised that very little information was available about rattan. It was puzzling knowing that rattan was so widely used around the world. So, when I accepted my post in Singapore, I knew that would give me the opportunity to work with rattan in situ, so to speak, in a place where rattan has been used for centuries. There are 4 parts of today's presentation. The first one will briefly look how rattan is represented in Southeast Asia, Japan, and Smithsonian collections. In the second part, I will look at rattan as a plant. And the third one will report on fieldwork and analysis, a fieldwork during which I collected samples of rattan and how I designed the methodology and analysis. And the last part is going to report on characteristic features of rattan, which could be used to determine if an object was made of rattan or not. The gallery of images which you see at the top shows features of rattan, which I'll discuss later in detail. So going from the left, you can see 2 images of a cross-section of rattan stem, which shows characteristic sieve-like structure of large cells, large vessels. And the next 2 images are showing patholites in the stem, their structure, and on the very right, on the last slide, chemistry of those patholites. And I will revisit them later in this presentation. The first feature of rattan, which defines its quality, is its surface, lustrous and shiny, as we see on the left side on a child coat. But what if the surface is matte? It doesn't have any luster on the surface. Is this material really rattan? If so, why is so different? Those questions were asked by conservators in Singapore who worked with those 2 objects which you see on the screen, and both were described as made of rattan. Through analysis and looking at how rattan is being worked in the field, we will follow a journey of transformation of rattan into artifacts. So the object which you see on the left is child's coat, which was made in 1970. It's currently on exhibit at the National Museum of Singapore. On the right, you see contemporary artwork, which is a large structure representing Indonesian konde, created by a Japanese artist, Nindito Adipurnomo, in 1987. The insets, the smaller images at the top, are showing the surface characteristics from both objects. On the left, the shiny and glassy, and on the right, rough and fibrous. And by the way, those samples are approximately 2 millimeters each. So what you see are actually images taken with digital microscope. Before embarking on the laboratory analysis, I had to understand the cultural context, especially where rattan was found. How was it transformed into objects? What was the object's purpose? So, a brief overview of how rattan objects are presented in museums gives us insight into prominent role rattan played in daily life. I started with a survey of collection in Singapore. By the way, the Heritage Center houses a large collection of incredibly interesting rattan objects. And next, I virtually visited the collection at the Smithsonian and also at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which holds a sizable representation of Japanese rattan objects. Rattan is an integral part of Southeast Asia life. It is used so prevalently that the researchers of the region coined a phrase, rattan culture. Rattan was used as the sole material in creating daily objects, from large structures like suspended bridges or supports for houses, to myriads of small vessels, containers, baskets, or mats. It was also used in combination with other materials, as you can see at the bottom left, where rattan was used to tighten coconut shell with wooden supports. The rattan was also used in combination with grasses and wood, as you can see at the bottom right, in creation of a cage which was used to capture birds. The most interesting, I thought, was the use of rattan to create and structure protective war gear to shield the warriors in tribal wars. The shield, which is shown in the top and next to it a helmet, were made in Taiwan and Sumatra. The use of rattan in making the war gear is also testimony how durable that material was. The Southeast Asia collections are vast and diverse, and the evidence that rattan indeed was part of everyday life. And the most prevalent use of rattan, as we probably all know, can be traced in basketry and mats, mainly because of rattan qualities, unsurpassed durability and flexibility. And here we see baskets which are showing their diverse use. Going from the left, you see baskets which are used to collect plants in the field. Next to it is a basket which was holding ceremonial rice. It is decorated with gold and sculptures and painted. And the very one on the right is a basket which was used for capturing fish. Those three examples are from Laos, and they are dating for early 19th century. And by the way, I would like to bring to your attention that all of those objects are quite dark, and that is characteristic for older examples of rattan in older artifacts. And that observation I made when I work with collections from the whole region, and not only, in fact, from Southeast Asia. We will go back to that the subject in this presentation. Plated rattan arts have a large presence not only in Southeast Asia, but also played a prominent role in neighboring countries like Japan and China, and for centuries. And here are just a few examples of Japanese plated arts which are housed in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And you see those two examples on the right. One on the left is an example from Kyoto Women's University, from the Lifestyle Design Laboratory. And that rattan is showing an interesting and unique way of plating, which is referred to as Hana Musubi, which means not weaving. And the uniqueness of pattern and weaving will be revisited later. And that is also one of the indicating factors and characteristics where the objects came from. The examples of Japanese plated arts at the Metropolitan Museum of Art are showing the work of a master craftsman, Hayakawa Shokosai. And Shokosai is believed to be the first master craftsman of baskets who signed his creations. And that is attributed to probably inspiration by Western artists. And we can see that inspiration also in the design which he created, especially here in the top right, how the head was structured. And that is probably a clear influence of Western art, which is actually in this case combining traditional plating of rattan with design of a Western head. Shokosai, however, is mostly known for his tea ceremony utensils, which were primarily made of rattan, and also baskets for those utensils, also made of rattan. And one example you see in the bottom right. The basket brought him to prominence in 1877 when one of his central works, which refers to a basket with lid and handle, received the Phoenix Prize at the first domestic industrial exposition held in Tokyo. Another example of a very interesting object is inro, a small container which was used as a purse. What is interesting about it is that here a tortoise shell is wrapped in rattan lattice. And the concept is not unique to Japan. It is attributed to a Western tradition of protecting medicine or wine bottles from breaking. And examples can be also seen and encountered in Southeast Asia in areas which were under Western colonization. As you can see, example from Sumatra, which is part of the collection in Singapore. Now, what about the West? Rattan in the West is known mainly as material in creating furniture of high quality, decorative, and highly valued, demonstrating appreciation of the unique artistic qualities that rattan presents as a material. Its value was recognized by the designers and artists, as exemplified here by the collection at the Smithsonian-Museum of Design in New York, Cooper Hewitt, and in the collection of Smithsonian-American Art Museum in Washington, D.C. In the center, there's an example of an elegant chair, one of the first toned so-called bent chair from 1860. And the company style is still being reproduced. And interestingly enough, the company is still run by the fifth generation of Tonnets. It is Austrian company still active. The other two chairs, one on the left and one on the right, represent a high quality design. On the left, which is Maguire Chair, embodies a classic design for modern luxury. The one on the right, representing a colonial revival, a gift of Miss Betty Beale, a prominent Washingtonian, exemplifies splendor and wealth of the donor. Rattan was also used in combination with other materials, as shown on the right, at the top and bottom, adding the artistic value to objects. That can be seen especially in the ceramic teapot, which was created by Midwestern potter Carl Erickson, which you see at the bottom right. He's blending the aesthetic elements of the American Midwest with Far East elements, here represented by the addition of rattan handle. And just again, I would like to point out, you can see different color of rattan. And again, as I mentioned earlier, older the objects are, darker rattan become. And that is something which some authors attribute to photochemical changes in the material, but I believe there is something else happening in the bulk of rattan, which could be just polymerization of different components. In transition from a survey of museum collections, let's have a look how that biogenic silica, which we admire on different artifacts, is being formed by the plant itself. My first encounter with rattan growing in nature was on Alor Island, Indonesia in 2016. And you see on the left side a solitary cluster which grew on high elevation of around 2,000 feet above the sea level, which is not really typical environment for rattan, and probably because of that it was relatively easily accessible. But nevertheless, it was still challenging to separate one strand from that cluster. Rattan is a climbing palm which utilizes its hooks to form attachments to a tree. And on the right, you see different types of such hooks. The top one, which shows small but strong hooks, they are quite deadly, I have to say, because of the grip they impose on any surface. And when they come in contact with bypasser, they could be quite deadly and painful, and I can attest to that. So what you see in the center, in fact, is an illustration of the very first step of processing rattan. I refer to it as on a village level, as opposed to a factory processing where large amounts of rattan is being processed. And I'll describe that later. It shows here a removal of outer skin first to facilitate the separation of rattan from the cluster. The trip to Alor supplied me with the only fresh sample of rattan, which was a source of multi-instrumental analysis. And by the way, you can see in the top right that very sample, which I analyzed in many different ways. On your left at the bottom, you see the still fresh sample, a cross-section, a micrograph, which is showing different layers, a spiky external layer, and emerald green layer underneath, which is silica, biogenic silica, and the cross-section of the stem. And you can also see that the characteristic cellular structure is not yet well defined. The same sample after 14 days is showing much more pronounced pattern of that characteristic sieve-like structure of large cells, and you can see in the central image. And the emerald green, which you see from the front in the next image, that is a biogenic silica, and when it's fresh, it is gel-like and colloidal to touch. After several days, it changed and solidified, probably through polymerization, to form that glassy and glossy layer which we see on furniture. So that is captured on the very bottom image. A trip to Alor was one of many. The places that I visited were selected based on the origin of objects that I studied. And my objective was to collect the samples from those places and to learn how rattan was processed in order to design more informed preservation strategy for rattan collections and objects. Now this map illustrates places which I identified as origin of some of the artifacts, and those places are marked as green stars, and places which I visited, which are marked as yellow squares, and where I collected samples of new rattan, and sometimes I also purchased artifacts. And those samples and artifacts constituted my reference collection. We will visit places where rattan was processed on a village level, on Borneo and in Cambodia, in small batches, and also another place where rattan was processed commercially, in Surabaya, Indonesia, to observe how different processes applied to rattan, and especially to the surface, had impact on quality of the material. So first, let's go to Borneo. Borneo is historically one of the main suppliers of rattan, both the Malayan side on the western part of Borneo, Sarawak and Sabah, as well as Indonesian part, which is central and eastern Borneo, known as Kalimantan, and that part belongs to Indonesia. I visited Borneo on 3 occasions, reaching communities that live deep in the rainforest. And the waterways were in most cases the only means to reach those communities. And the rainforest is absolutely enchanting. As you can see me inhaling the beauty of the surrounding. That was my very first trip and very first encounter of the rainforest. And that trip was to Iban people, settlement deep in the rainforest. Ibans are one of the 2 main tribes which are occupying Sarawak. But I have to say that this very first trip was not as productive as I hoped for or I planned. The next trip, 3 years later, was to Lamai, Longbanga near Brunei, and that provided me with great insights of how the community processed rattan and which rattan was harvested for specific applications. And I just need to mention that there are around 600 species of rattan, but only around 20% of that is used commercially. In Lamai, I was able to observe several species of rattan growing in its natural environment, which is nowadays not easily traceable. So what you see in the center is one of those rattan with very prominent spikes, and now you can appreciate how deadly some of the spikes could be, and that is also making quite difficult and challenging to extract rattan from natural environment. Along the top you see 2 images showing the unique pattern that is characteristic for Borneo plated arts on mats, on hats and baskets. Alor Island, which I mentioned earlier, is around 1,500 kilometers from Borneo, is also using rattan and plated arts. Here is a long view of rattan small baskets used in a similar way as Westerners are using their purses. The villagers are wearing them during their famous Lego Lego dance, which was performed all night long as a change of harvest season. And I was very fortunate to arrive just at the time to observe that Lego Lego dance. In addition to basketry, rattan is also used on Alor Island for garment accessories. And here is one exquisite example of a belt worn by a Bowie chief. And it shows the mastery of plating skill. That belt was passed on by his father, so it's passed on from generation to generation. The other image on the left is a close-up of Hanna Japanese basket, which you have seen before, which shows that very different way of plating. So regional methods of working rattan provide information about the origin of the artifact. So in addition to characteristics of the material, we can also look at the patterns and ways of working the material and transforming that into artifacts. Now, understanding better the cultural context and learning about the material in its natural environment, I looked closely at the methods of processing rattan, and that it was followed by laboratory analysis. So looking again at our 2 artifacts which posed those questions at the very beginning of our presentation, and why those 2 objects made of rattan show such a stark difference between the surface quality. So, looking closely at the surface, the method of removing the outer layer with a heavy knife, both in Cambodia, which you see on the right, in the top right, in a small family plant, was identical to the way in which surface was treated in a large commercial factory in Surabaya on the left side, left top. And that is located 5,600 kilometers from Cambodia. On the left side, even though you can see treatment of the surface with a knife, that was like the final touch which workers applied in finishing rattan. It was processed in many different ways, but the same application of knife was actually observed in those two places. So, looking closely under a microscope at the surface, which you can see at the bottom left and center, treatment with a knife and removal of that surface left a very characteristic pattern. It's almost like ragged shape edges of whatever was left on the stem. Comparing that with the surface of a historic piece, which you see at the very bottom right, we may deduce that what we see most likely indicates how rattan was worked, rather than attributing that appearance to deterioration. There are definitely similarities in the shape of, I call it, islands of silica. And by the way, the small inset above that image is a digital micrograph generated by Confocal laser scanning microscope, which shows clearly the tool marks on the surface. The silica layer not always is present, as you remember from our very first slides of contemporary artwork, and could be completely removed. And how that was done became really clear when I visited another rattan processing plant in Surabaya, also in 2016. So what we see here is a bunch of small, in the center you see a bunch of small in diameter rattan strands, which were cut out from a larger in diameter stem, which was pushed through the knife which the man is holding to for us to see. So that was exactly what we observed in terms of surface quality in our contemporary art piece, which was fibrous, rough, and showed internal structure of rattan stem. And by the way, on the left side, you see different type of knives which are producing different shapes of rattan strands when they are pushed through those knives. So based on the previously shown methods of working rattan, and in particular how the heavy glassy layer of silica was removed, I identified the following patterns of biogenic silica on artifacts. So going from the left, it could be, the silica could be left intact, untouched, and that is being seen as lustrous, glassy and glossy surface, as we observed on our child's coat, and that is probably the most desired appearance of rattan. It could be partially removed, and example was seen on the fresh stem of rattan, which I imaged from places where rattan was processed, in contemporary places. And I call those left parts as silica islands. Or it could be completely removed, as we observed on our contemporary artwork. There are also splits, and that is only part of the stem, which is literally peeled off from the stem, and that is being done when a flat type of fiber is necessary to plate a mat or basket. And silica on splits could be present on entire surface or in other combinations as fragments of silica, or sometimes is completely removed as well. So the final step was laboratory analysis of rattan surface. That analysis aimed to identify what features of rattan can be established as common and characteristic for the identification of the material. The micrographs which you see here were generated by different microscopes. So you see on the top right, the first one, the colorful, was generated by light microscope, optical microscope, in transmitted light. And the one on the very right is generated by scanning electron microscope. And you can see me at the bottom left, working on scanning electron micrograph, preparing samples for analysis. And how the sample is prepared, you see at the very center, the black sort of round example. This is how on small stubs the samples are attached to a black carbon tape and next placed in the chamber of skin electron microscope. So the micrographs which you see on the second row, which are also color-coded, those are basically maps which are showing distribution of different chemical elements in our sample. What is really red, it's actually showing location of biogenic silica, and I selected color red. It could be entirely up to the user, so it is arbitrarily not selected prior to examination, just to emphasize in this case presence of the layer which I was looking for. The close-up of the glassy layer is shown here at different magnification in skin electron micrographs. Both of them are generated by skin electron microscope. So again, the sample which we are looking at came from our child's coat. So first, what we see on the left, we are looking at the top of the glassy surface, which clearly already defined cellular pattern. And next to it, we see the formation and morphology of that surface at a bit higher magnification, just only 500 times. It also allowed us to measure that layer. We also measured confocal laser scanning microscope later, around 70 to 80 microns. So what is also important to take away from that image is that that silica layer is sort of organically bound to fibrous layer underneath. So it's not that easy to separate that layer from the plant. And that is important information for conservators, as I'll explain in a moment. As to the surface chemistry, this micrograph is a combination of skin electron micrograph and EDS. A mapping confirms that the entire layer was pretty much composed of primarily of silica. So on the spectrum below, on the bottom left, you can see that the predominant element was silica, and that is expressed by the highest peak present in that set of spectrum. So the height of the peak really indicates how much of a particular element is detected by the instrument. Also, please note, I would like to bring your attention to some interesting inclusions which you see as raw, almost like pearls, arranged on the sample, which is in the top right and below and top left of that large image. And in a moment, I'll reveal the details of what it is and how significant the discovery for me was. Just saying more about the surface. Over 40 samples of rattan were analyzed, of both fresh and historic rattan. And the pattern of a silica surface was not diminished in all the samples, which is telling us that the aging really did not change the configuration in any way. The cellular pattern, without a doubt, can serve as identifying feature of rattan. So this is one of the unique characteristics which could differentiate rattan from other materials, from other plants, which are also producing biogenic silica. And one example could be bamboo. So what you see at the very top is illustration of the contemporary artwork, which you remember from the first slide, which did not have any surface. It's showing that rugged, rough surface of rattan, but also small inclusions of most likely silica components in the bulk of rattan. So now, revealing the mystery of inclusions. And here is their detailed examination in skin electron microscope and EDS. So those inclusions are patholites, also called silica bodies, or opals, and they are produced by plants. In fact, there are many plants which produce patholites, but their shape is unique to each plant. So therefore, they are testimony of what kind of plants grew 1,000 years earlier. Long after the plant tissue is gone, opals remain in soil, because silica is a very resilient chemical, like tiny grains of sand, and survives passage of time. So the study of patholites is part of paleontology. In addition to chemical composition, the surface topography was examined with confocal laser scanning microscope. And that type of microscope is a metrological instrument that allows to measure intricate elements on the surface. So in relatively fresh material of rattan, laser penetrated the top layer, revealing a different cellular structure of silica layer underneath. And you can see comparison of those two. On the left, you can see separation of the layers by that microscope, which is giving us visualization of different strata. And on the right, in the center, you see the different pattern, one which is top and one which is beneath the top layer. That sample, by the way, was from a contemporary mat which I collected in Kuching in Borneo, so you can recognize right away that characteristic pattern of plated arts in Borneo. To supplement the information which derived from previous analysis, additional measurements were carried out. So what you see here are 3D topography maps of the surface features. And again, they were collected in confocal laser scanning microscope from old sample, our child's coat, and also new material, which allowed us to differentiate those two layers. So what you see at the bottom right is really a glassy and smooth top surface, and on the left next to it, much more cellular, although much thinner layer which was underneath. And there's a small profile which is below that central image, which is also illustrating how we measure the height of each feature. So we can extract quite a bit of information using metrology instruments, which are not yet so popular in application to cultural heritage. So in summary, what features can be considered as identifying rattan that unequivocally could be confirmed as artifact is made of rattan or not? I would group those features in two categories. One would be surface and the other one would be bulk. So the surface, which shows a unique and characteristic pattern of cells, is grouped on the left side. The surface also could be clearly defined and measured. On the right is a group of bulk material. In the top you see cross sections, and even a small split fragment could show the characteristic pattern of a sieve-like large cellular structures. And the stem of rattan, if we have a fragment of a stem, will contain opals, and their shape is the most undisputable confirmation that the plant indeed is rattan. So in closure, all the information which I presented today and much more, you will find in my paper which I published in 2017 in the Study of Conservation Journal. The works which I share today could not be possible without the willingness of artisans and artists working with rattan in the region, who were kind enough to share their knowledge. And that was typical for the family in Cambodia. You can see at the bottom left, to the artist Nidupadi Purnomo, who invited me to his studio in Yogyakarta, and also working with Abui chief, which you can see at the bottom right, who was calling with me a freshly collected rattan. So working in Southeast Asia region with historical material was really an extremely rewarding undertaking. So thank you all for your attention, and I'll be happy to take some questions.